The legend of Octavia Hatcher. Imagine waking up in total darkness, the air running out, and realizing you're buried alive. This nightmare has haunted human imagination for centuries, and in some chilling cases, it became a horrifying reality. One of the most infamous stories of premature burial is the tragic tale of Octavia Hatcher, a young mother whose story still echoes through the quiet town of Pikeville, Kentucky, and serves as a haunting reminder of how fragile life and death can be. It was the spring of 1891. Octavia Hatcher had recently given birth to her first child, a baby boy named Jacob. Life should have been full of joy for her and her husband, James Hatcher, but tragedy struck shortly after Jacob's birth. The baby became sick and died in infancy, sending Octavia into a deep depression. Overwhelmed with grief, her health began to decline. Octavia soon fell gravely ill, slipping into a deep, unshakable coma. The doctors in Pikeville, puzzled by her sudden illness, declared her dead when they could no longer detect any signs of life. This was a time before modern medical equipment, and the line between life and death wasn't always as clear. Given the warm climate and the medical understanding of the time, it was customary to bury bodies quickly. And so James, devastated by his wife's sudden death, arranged for her to be buried just days after she was declared dead. Octavia's burial was a sorrowful affair. Her body was placed in a simple wooden coffin, and she was laid to rest in the Hatcher family plot in Pikeville Cemetery, where her husband and family grieved their heartbreaking loss. But even after the funeral, something didn't feel right. As James mourned the loss of his wife and child, something strange began happening in Pikeville. Other people in town started to fall ill with the same symptoms Octavia had experienced. They too slipped into deep comas, but unlike Octavia, they began to wake up. This terrifying turn of events led to a horrifying realization. Was it possible that Octavia had been buried alive? James couldn't shake the thought. The idea of his wife trapped in her coffin, struggling to breathe, filled him with dread. Overcome with fear and guilt, he decided to have her body exhumed. When the coffin was opened, what they found was worse than anyone could have imagined. Octavia's body showed clear signs that she had been buried alive. Her fingernails were broken, and there were deep scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid. Her face was contorted in terror, as if she had fought desperately to escape her dark, suffocating tomb. Octavia had been buried alive, a victim of a tragic misunderstanding and a lack of medical knowledge. The realization was too much for James to bear. To honor his wife's memory, he commissioned a large monument to be built in her likeness, which still stands in Pikeville Cemetery today. The statue of Octavia stands above her grave, holding her arms out as if reaching for help. Over the years, the tragic story of Octavia Hatcher has evolved into an eerie legend. Locals claim that on the anniversary of her death, strange things happened near her grave. Some say they've seen her statue's face turn downward in sorrow, while others claim to have heard faint scratching sounds coming from below the ground. Still others insist they've seen her ghost, wandering the cemetery at night, searching for peace that never came in life. Though more than a century has passed, the story of Octavia Hatcher remains one of the most chilling examples of the fear of being buried alive. It serves as a stark reminder of a time when death was not always as certain as we assume today. The real story behind Charlie No Face urban legends are often built on fear and misunderstanding, and few illustrate this better than the legend of Charlie No Face, a ghostly figure that haunted the roads of Pennsylvania for decades. Stories of a faceless man with glowing green skin roaming the highways at night terrified locals. Some said he was a mutant, the result of a horrible accident or even an alien. But behind this gruesome myth is the story of a real man, Raymond Robinson, whose tragic life was twisted into a frightening urban legend. Raymond's story begins in 1919, when he was just a child. Like many young boys, Raymond was full of curiosity and adventure. One warm summer day, while playing near a local bridge in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, Raymond saw a bird's nest high up near a power line. He decided to climb the pole to get a better look, unaware of the danger that awaited him. As Raymond reached for the nest, he accidentally touched a live wire carrying thousands of volts of electricity. The shock was so severe that it knocked him unconscious and caused horrific injuries. His face was badly disfigured. He lost his eyes, nose, and most of his facial features. His skin, burned by the electricity, healed in a greenish way, making him appear otherworldly. Despite his injuries, Raymond survived, but his appearance caused him to live a life of isolation. In a time before acceptance of differences, people stared at him, whispered behind his back, or worse, openly ridiculed him. As a result, Raymond chose to stay out of sight during the day, venturing out only at night to avoid being seen. During these nighttime walks, Raymond would follow the same path along a stretch of dark road, minding his own business. But as word spread about a faceless man wandering the roads, rumors and wild stories began to grow. People started calling him Charlie No Face, claiming that he was a dangerous, faceless ghost who roamed the highways, looking for victims. The legend grew more elaborate, with each retelling. Some said his skin glowed, others that he attacked anyone who dared approach him. In reality, Raymond was far from the terrifying figure the legend made him out to be. Those who were brave enough to approach him on his walks found a kind, quiet man who was more than willing to chat. He even allowed people to take photos with him, sometimes trading a picture for a cigarette. Raymond's life was hard, but he found ways to cope, and he became somewhat of a local legend in his own right. He continued his nighttime walks until his death in 1985, and though the man behind the myth was gone, the legend of Charlie No Face lived on. The story of Raymond Robinson is a stark reminder of how easily real people can be transformed into monsters by society's fear of the unknown. Behind every legend, there's often a deeper, sadder truth. Slender Man, the internet's dark creation, unlike the legends of Octavia Hatcher and Raymond Robinson, which evolved over many years. The story of Slender Man was born in the digital age, a product of the internet that took on a life of its own and led to real-world tragedy. In 2009, an online forum called Something Awful held a contest asking users to create their own paranormal images. Among the submissions was a simple yet eerie image created by Eric Knudsen. The image showed a tall, faceless figure in a black suit, standing in the background of an old, grainy photograph of children playing. This figure became known as Slender Man, and the story that followed was simple but terrifying. Slender Man was a supernatural being who stalked and kidnapped children, luring them into the woods, never to be seen again. Slender Man's appearance was creepy, but it was his mystery that captured the imagination of the internet. People began creating fan fiction, artwork, and videos, each adding their own twists to the character's mythos. He became a modern-day boogeyman, lurking in the dark corners of the internet, with his story growing more elaborate and terrifying over time. For most, Slender Man was nothing more than an online story, a spooky tale to scare friends with. But for some, the line between fiction and reality blurred, with devastating consequences. In 2014, two 12-year-old girls, Morgan Geyser and Anissa Ware, became obsessed with Slender Man. They believed that if they didn't offer him a human sacrifice, he would come after them and their families. To prove their loyalty, they lured their friend, Peyton Leutner, into the woods and stabbed her 19 times. Miraculously, Peyton survived the attack, crawling to a nearby road where she was found by a passing cyclist. Morgan and Anissa were arrested and later diagnosed with serious mental health issues, but the case shocked the world. It highlighted the dangers of internet myths and how they could impact young, impressionable minds. Slender Man may have started as a simple story, but his reach extended far beyond the digital world, showing how deeply online culture can influence reality. The power of legends, whether passed down through generations or born in the digital age. Urban legends have a unique power to tap into our deepest fears. The stories of Octavia Hatcher, Charlie No Face, and Slender Man each reveal something different about the nature of fear and how it can shape our perception of the world. Some legends, like Octavia's, are rooted in real tragedies, their details becoming twisted over time into something darker and more mysterious. Others, like the story of Raymond Robinson, show how society's fear of the unknown can turn a real person into a monster. And then there are legends like Slender Man, which prove that even in our modern, rational world, myths can still hold dangerous power. Behind every urban legend is a grain of truth, and it's this truth that keeps these stories alive. They remind us that sometimes reality is just as terrifying as fiction. Once I was sure it was safe, I dashed out of that creepy place faster than I ever had before. My heart raced, and adrenaline pumped through my veins. But soon, I found myself in the middle of nowhere, with no cars or public transport in sight. Just me and the vast, empty landscape. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally spotted a paved road in the distance. I headed in the direction I remembered coming from, hoping it would lead me back to civilization. As I walked along the road, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that clung to me. Hours passed, and just when I thought I'd be stuck forever in this desolate place, a car drove by and finally stopped. If this were a horror movie, it would have been Gary and his friends pulling up, ready to confront me. But luckily, it was a kind family who stopped to help. They greeted me with warm smiles and offered me a ride into town. Gratefully, I climbed into their car, relieved to finally be heading back to safety. A few days after I left that strange farm, the listing for it disappeared from the website. I haven't heard from Gary since that day, and whenever I think back to that encounter, a chill runs down my spine. When I share this story with others, some laugh and say Gary and his friends were probably just coming over to chat. But I trust my instincts. Something about them felt really off, and I knew deep down that I had escaped something dangerous. I grew up living with my aunt, uncle, and older siblings in a remote area, far from other houses. Our home was surrounded by a big pasture, with nothing but open land around it. On our property, there was an old, abandoned cabin we never used. My uncle loved telling me stories about the land, particularly about the people who lived there long before us. He had a knack for spinning tales that captivated my imagination, even if some of them were a little spooky. One night, he told me a particularly scary tale about the old cabin. It used to belong to a farmer and his young daughter. They lived alone, with the father working hard to keep the farm running. His daughter was only about 6 years old, with fair skin, long dark hair, and a cheerful personality that lit up the room. Everyone loved her, and she was the joy of her father's life. One fateful day, while the farmer was using his tractor to harvest crops, a terrible accident occurred. His daughter was playing nearby, close to where he was working. He saw her too late and tried to shout for her to move, but she didn't hear him. In a split second, a horrific tragedy unfolded. It was a heartbreaking accident that shook the entire community. As a little girl myself, I found it hard to believe that something so awful could really happen. Or maybe I just didn't want to believe it because it scared me so much. The idea of losing someone so precious terrified me. My brother, Robert, is your typical strong and fearless guy. He was muscular and brave, and I had never seen him cry until this incident. One weekend, Robert decided to invite a few of his friends over for a camping trip. They planned to stay in the old abandoned cabin on our property, thinking it was time to clean it up and make use of it again. They were excited about the project, spending hours fixing up the cabin before their camping adventure. My uncle had only shared the story about the farmer and his daughter with me, but Robert and his friends knew nothing about it. As the sun began to set, they made their way to the cabin, full of energy and laughter, doing what boys do when they're together. But what I remember most is what happened when they were getting ready to go to sleep. I'll never forget the look on Robert's face when he ran back to the house, sweating and out of breath. He and his friends looked visibly shaken, as if they had just seen a ghost. Robert had gone to bed a little later than his friends and was lying in one of the old beds in the cabin. In the middle of the night, he woke up because he thought he heard someone crying, followed by a faint scream coming from outside. The sound seemed to be coming from somewhere out in the pasture, and it sent chills down his spine. He said it felt like something was trying to get into the cabin, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He tried to ignore it and go back to sleep, thinking it might just be coyotes howling in the distance. But the sobbing continued, haunting him and making it impossible for him to relax. After a few minutes of tossing and turning, he got really frustrated because the crying and screaming wouldn't stop. Finally, he sat up in his bed, trying to gather his courage. What he saw next scared him so much that it would stay with him for the rest of his life. There, at the foot of his bed, was a little girl. He couldn't see her face clearly because her body was covered in cuts and bruises, but he could tell she was very young. She had long, dark hair and was crying non-stop. The sound was heart-wrenching, the kind of crying that makes your stomach twist in pain because it sounded like she was suffering, and there was nothing anyone could do to help her. When Robert and his friends finally ran back to the house, they woke everyone up to tell us what happened in the cabin. It was hard to understand him at first. My brother Robert was actually crying, which had never happened before. My aunt tried to comfort him, and his friends stood there in shock, unable to speak. It was a night none of them would ever forget. It wasn't until the next day that I told my brother about the story of the farmer and his daughter that my uncle had shared with me. The old cabin had been burned down years ago, so maybe the farmer's daughter could finally rest in peace. I could see the fear in Robert's eyes as he listened to my story. It was a strange connection to make, knowing that the haunting he experienced was tied to the tale of tragedy my uncle had told. As I reflect on those events, I remember growing up on that farm west of the Mississippi. My brother and I both had strange experiences as kids. Our farm was vast, with thousands of acres primarily used for growing corn. When the corn was fully grown, the fields seemed endless. On days when we weren't busy with chores, my brother and I would explore the tall, rustling stalks. Most of the time, we stayed close to the house, but every once in a while, we'd venture deep into the cornfields, feeling like we were in a giant green jungle. We always found something interesting, whether it was a secret spot or an animal. Those were some of my favorite memories from childhood. One sunny afternoon, we decided to explore again, but this time we aimed for a creek on the far edge of our farm. It was a place we rarely visited because it was so far from the house. We had been to the creek a few times before, and the cool, refreshing water made the long walk worthwhile, especially on hot summer days. As we got closer to the creek, we were just walking and chatting when, out of nowhere, we stepped out of the thick corn into a clearing. This open space was about 40 or 50 feet wide, surrounded by tall corn on all sides. It felt strange because clearings like that weren't supposed to be in the middle of a cornfield. We had never seen anything like it before. When we reached the edge of the clearing, we saw about 10 men standing inside. They all stopped whatever they were doing as soon as they noticed us. Everything went silent, and they stared at us with wide eyes, looking shocked and worried as if we had caught them doing something they shouldn't be doing. In those few seconds of staring, I noticed some details. The men were all white and appeared to be in their 40s or 50s. They looked more like office workers than farmhands, dressed in neat clothes like button-up shirts and slacks. There were several large pieces of electronic equipment set up on the cleared dirt. It looked bulky and appeared to be equipment that could be folded up into big carrying cases, similar to how band equipment is packed for quick transport. The setup made the clearing look more like a makeshift workspace than a part of our farm. One of the men stepped forward, reaching out his hand, as if he was about to say something. His expression was a mix of surprise and concern. But seeing this, my brother and I didn't wait to find out what would happen next. We turned and ran as fast as we could, sprinting through the cornfields and all the way back to the house. We didn't say a word to each other during the run. We were both too scared and unsure of what we had just witnessed. When we got back to the house, we wanted to tell our parents about what happened, but our mom was in town and our dad was busy helping a neighbor. A few hours later, when Dad finally came home, we met him at the end of the driveway. After listening to us talk excitedly, but a bit hysterically, about what we had seen, he decided to come back with us to check it out. Since it was already dark by then, Dad said we would go first thing in the morning. I think he figured he'd just go along with us to make us stop talking about it. The next day, we all went to the spot where my brother and I had seen the clearing. But when we got there, it was empty. The clearing was gone, just like the men who had been there. Dad agreed it was strange that all the corn had been cleared away, but he didn't believe anything was wrong. He thought it could have been harmless, something we might have imagined. My brother and I still talk about that day sometimes, and we both agree it was one of the weirdest and most unsettling experiences we've ever had. It's funny how certain memories linger in your mind, weaving their way into the fabric of your life. Those moments from my childhood, both the spooky tales and the inexplicable experiences, shaped who I am today. I often wonder if the stories my uncle told us were merely folklore, or if they held some deeper truth. The haunting tales of the farmer and his daughter, the strange men in the clearing, and the eerie feelings that sometimes washed over me during my childhood, they all make me reflect on the mysteries that surround us. Whether we like it or not, those experiences leave a mark, a reminder that not everything is as it seems. Looking back, I realize that the past is like a ghost itself, haunting us, teaching us, and shaping our understanding of the world. As I share these stories with others, I hope to convey that sense of wonder and unease, the thrill of the unknown. Life is filled with mysteries waiting to be unraveled, and sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that linger long after we've turned off the lights and closed our eyes.